Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am very honored to be joined by Colin Campbell today. And Colin is from LA, and you are a writer and a director of theatre and film. And now you're going to be a published author as of March the 14th of a memoir called Finding the Words, Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose. So welcome.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much for being here. And it does feel like this book is going to be very profound for people to read. And you're sharing your own experience of your children who died in a car accident in 2019. So firstly, I'm sorry that happened to you. And it's always
thank you.
Sort of bittersweet thing when we say congratulations for a book like this. You'd much rather that you never had to write a book such as this. But I thought maybe firstly you could tell us about your children, Ruby and Hart, and start there.
Yeah. I would love to talk about Ruby and Hart. Yeah. So Ruby was an artist. She was a budding artist. So she was killed when she was 17 years old. So she was still very young. But she was already, her art was exploding. It was quite extraordinary to watch her. Like she just discovered watercolors a few months earlier and was suddenly painting these amazing watercolors of these rocks in Utah that we went to during spring break. And she was working on a graphic novel. She was animating just by herself with a computer, frame by frame, animating this amazing story she was creating about a lesbian Jewish vampire who fights Nazis. And it was wild and amazing. And Hart was our clown. He was he was the life of any party. And everybody wanted to glom onto him and follow his lead and mimic his ridiculous characters that he created. So he was killed when he was 14 years old, even younger. But they were beautiful spirits, and so kind. Kindness was really important to both of them. Ruby came out as a lesbian, I guess 2 years before she was killed, and she happily, by the end, really embraced it. She loved being out and proud, and it was so important to her to protect people who were being bullied. And so at her school, everybody was like, she was so cool that everybody loved her. And her coolness allowed her to sort of stop bullying at the school. I know it sounds kind of strange to say that, but it really was true. She really did. She was like the protector that everybody loved. And Hart was a fierce ally of hers as well. Yeah, they were a beautiful team. Their love for each other was quite extraordinary as well. I know teen siblings can often squabble, and they had their little squabbles, but at the heart, they loved each other so profoundly.
Thank you so much for sharing about them and for us to get to know a bit about them. And then, of course, your life was turned upside down and grief happened. And you said that at first it was just so painful to like even look at their photo, and there's that sort of instinctual reaction to pain that we want to kind of avoid and run from as soon as possible. But you quite quickly decided that wasn't going to be, you weren't going to do that. And
yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a moment. It was a real like moment of revelation for me. It was about 2 days after the crash, and I was in my living room, and we had these giant blow up photos of Ruby and Hart all taped to the walls of the living room. A friend of ours made four of them for the funeral, two pictures each, and then we asked her to make four more. So we had 8 giant 2x3 photos of Ruby and Hart just to feel them in our house. And 2 days after the crash, I was sitting in my living room, and I didn't want to look at them. It was too painful, and I looked away. And in that moment, I realized, oh my God, I'm looking away from my own children. How can I do that? How can I be so scared of the pain that I'm going to block out my own children? And I wouldn't let that happen. I was just like, I can't have that happen. And so, yeah, I was just crying and through the tears saying, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of you. Because I wanted to be able to think about them and have the beautiful memories we had and be able to feel that love and remember the joy. And so in that moment, it just seemed so clear to me that if I want the joy, if I want to still think about Ruby and Hart, I've got to also feel the pain. I can't be frightened of it. No matter how scary it is, it's not going to be so scary that I'm gonna run from my own children.
Mm.
Yeah, and that really was that taught me a valuable lesson that helped me as I moved forward, because so often things are scary. So often you feel the fear of like, it's going to be hurt. It's going to cause me pain if I go back to our favorite restaurant. So I'll never go back there again. And then I think, well, wait a minute. I have all these beautiful memories in that restaurant. I have to go back there, even though it's painful. And then sure enough, the more that I would say go back to that favorite restaurant, the easier it became and the more joyful it became to allow myself to feel those feelings.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me to, you wanted to block that pain initially, and that's kind of our reaction. And then the friends and your family around you, it's like how, they were finding it hard to know what to say in the face of this
Yeah.
circumstance. And you call the book finding the words. And you talk about how, and I have to admit, I've used this phrase before, there are no words, because when something is just so fatal and tragic, it's like, oh my gosh, what do we say? And so I find this really compelling, what you have to say about this.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, we would encounter that phrase, there are no words, so often. I mean, it was wild. It was like, oh my God. People would say it to you, and then they would write it in a letter, and then they would send it in an email and send it in a text. And after a while, you're like, wait a minute, what's happening? How does everybody know to use this phrase? And the phrase itself, I totally understand where it comes from. And I would certainly have done the same thing, absolutely, because it feels safe. It's like, I don't know what to say to you, and I just want to tell you that my love is so deep that I can't even express it, and my feelings for you are so deep. But the problem is that in a way it ends the conversation. It's saying that let's not talk about what's happening because it's just too big for us to understand or talk about. And the end result is that the people who are grieving feel isolated because they generally want to talk about what's happening to them. They want to talk about the people they've lost. And if everybody's telling you, we can't talk, there's no words, you just feel like you're alone. You're alone in this experience. So I totally understand where it's coming from. And like I said, I would have done the same thing. Absolutely. 100%. But on the other, coming from the other side, it seems so important that we do talk about it. We do find the words. Yeah. And also, there's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, which is that when we're talking to people who are grieving, we're not trying to take away their pain. We're not trying to even give them comfort. We're just trying to be there with them. So I think there's also the feeling of, what do I say to somebody? I can't fix their pain, so I'll try, and I'll try to say something upbeat, like they're in a better place, or look at the bright side, or some way to give comfort. But actually, that's not what the grieving need. They just need to be in community and have people sit with them. Mm-hmm. So they don't need their pain fixed, I think maybe it's a helpful thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure. And what you did, which was very smart, you had a community around you, and you were, observing that they didn't really know how to support you in your grief. So you took it upon yourself to step in and to ask for what you needed, which a lot of people
Yeah.
wouldn't think to do, right? A lot of us like to think
Yeah.
people should know what to do, or
Yeah.
so how did you kind of
I
ask your friends for help?
well, I I think it helped because I was so bad at it, I guess, from the other side. Before Ruby and Hart were killed, I wouldn't know what to say. We wouldn't know what to say. I would just not be helpful to somebody in grief because it would be too scary for me, and I wouldn't know what to say. And so I was able to have a lot of understanding and compassion for any friend of mine who didn't know what to say, because I was worse. So I think that helped me to realize, wow, if the shoe were on the other foot, I would really want to have someone to tell me what to do. How can I help my friend in grief? And and then there was just a feeling, that overwhelming feeling, that I needed to talk about Ruby and Hart and my grief. I just needed it so desperately. And friends would come into the front door of my house, and I just looked at their face, and they looked stricken. They looked scared. And I thought, wow, if I really want to have a real conversation with this beautiful friend who loves me, I, I've got to set I've got to set them at ease. I've got to reassure them that it's going to be okay to talk about Ruby and Hart, to say their names, to even talk about the car crash, and my pain. So that's my wife and I quickly learned to do. And those needs that we had, I think, in grief changed very, very quickly. Like in the very early parts of grief, what we needed to talk about was different, say, 2 weeks later or a month later, even. And so I developed this thing that I call my grief spiel, which I talk about in the book, which is just sort of, I pull someone aside and say, okay, here's the deal. I need to talk about Ruby and Hart. I need you to say their names. I need you to share a memory that you have with them. And I need you to ask about my pain. Um, and we can't talk about politics, or we can for like 2 minutes, but then we got to come back to my grief. But then that would change. Now I'm no longer, I don't need to talk about just Ruby and Hart and my grief anymore. I could talk about politics and other things. But in early grief, I really couldn't.
Yeah, and it was interesting how you mentioned that their friends were much more open to, like you say, share the memories about them and connect with you on
Yes.
that level, whereas the people in your generation were like so stuck in that way.
Yeah. That was also very, very surprising to me, that none of Ruby and Hart's friends said there are no words. Like at some point you learn to do that as an adult, I guess. You learn that's the safe thing to do. It's not going to cause anyone to cry, as if crying is bad. But kids don't know that. So they come right up and they just say, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I love Hart so much. He was the best thing in my life. They tell me some funny Hart story and they start crying. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful how open these kids were. And that they taught me, oh, this is what I need to hear.
Right.
Yeah.
And we are culturally, I'm from the UK, you're from the United States, but culturally we're similar in the way that we struggle with death and grief, and that you talked about how we're always taught about love, for example, but then we're not talking about
Mm,
that we lose people and grief, and we don't have we have a funeral, and then after the funeral we're kind of expected to sort of get on with life. And you talk about rituals, and this
yeah.
is really communal rituals and private rituals that really sustained you and your wife. And I'm so fascinated by this because I love the
Oh,
concept of us, like how we can, like modern ways that we can mourn. So would you be able to share
Yeah,
some of those things with us?
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for asking. So I come from, I say, like an atheist background. So culturally, and I love being an atheist, but culturally, I had no structures for grief. I had no idea how to grieve. And my wife is Jewish, and we raised our kids as Jews, so they were bar and bat mitzvah, and we were active members of our temple. And I discovered that it was so helpful to lean on the Jewish traditions of grieving. They're 5,000 years old. I figured they figured it out by now, and sure enough, um, so many of the rituals that are in the Jewish tradition taught me lessons about how to grieve. And in the book, I go on and on about all the different lessons, but one of the first lessons was grieving in community. So so Jews sit shiva for someone who's lost a loved one, which means you come over to their house and you sit with them every night for the first week after the funeral, and the rabbi comes and says some prayers, and then the community is there to support you. And if you want to cry, they can cry. If you want to laugh and tell funny stories, they can laugh and tell funny stories. It's really guided by the griever and where they're at in that moment. But our very wise rabbi turned to Gail and I the first night at Shiva and said, do you want to talk? Do you want to say anything?" And my first reaction to Shiva in general was, I've been grieving all day long, and now 100 people are going to come to my house. Are you kidding me? I don't want to see people. I'm in acute pain. But then I found, oh my gosh, I want to talk. I do want to talk to these people that love me. Oh my gosh, I want to talk about Ruby and Heart. I want to talk about my pain and my grief, and just to process it, just to understand what's happening. It's so, I don't say the word mysterious, but it's so challenging to my own identity, losing both my children. And so it was so helpful. And that was a really valuable early lesson from the Jewish tradition, which is that we don't grieve alone. And they have this very beautiful practice, which is saying the mourner's Kaddish. So you're supposed to say the mourner's Kaddish every day for the first year after you lose a loved one. But the trick is, you're not allowed to say it alone. You have to have at least 9 other people with you. So it's like, oh, yes, we have to feel the pain of our loss, but do it in community. Do it while people are with you. Don't be off in a corner all by yourself crying, cuddled up in your bed. Share your pain and grief and have people there saying amen, right? It's such a beautiful concept. And that was a real eye opener for me as well. Because before the crash, I really thought that you lose someone you love, you go off on your own. You leave your society, you go in your corner, you grieve until you get better, and then you come back to your community. And I really realized, no, 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 that's not how you grieve. You grieve with your community. You have time alone, of course, but you're grieving in community, because it's so helpful. It's so hard to grieve alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So has it shifted your spiritual beliefs?
Well, I have I guess the one spiritual belief that I've developed since the crash was this sense that we're not individuals, that we are made up of the love we share with the people in our community. Just because so much of I realize painfully how much of who I am is because of Ruby and Heart, and so they're here with me, they're in me because they made me who I am. Um, Therefore, we're that's true for everybody that we love and who loves us. So that's my feeling. That's my spirituality, I guess, which is just that, yeah, that we're not really individuals. We're part of a community.
Yeah. And so that's very to hear about your wife, you and your wife, and a lot. And it's great to have you on this series, by the way, because generally speaking, I don't get to interview many men on this.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So how, in your experience, have you seen the sort of difference between you and your wife and grief?
Yeah. I think that that's right that there's not a lot of men talking about it, and I think 'cause I don't know why culture that is exactly, but I noticed that my wife has a very large community of women friends that she can talk to about all this, and I was like looking around thinking I have guy friends, but not as many as Gail certainly, and not so that I would just call them up and let's just walk together and weep. And I needed that, and I was jealous, and so I thought, wow, I've got to change because frankly, I felt like I'd rather hang out with Ruby and Hart than with my guy friends most of the time. And so, and I don't know, maybe guys are just more closed off. Who knows? But I realized I have to change how I behaved. I had to say yes to everybody. If some guy friend called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to go for a walk?" I was going to say yes, no matter what. And that actually helped me in early grief because I didn't want to say yes. I wanted to just be by myself even more, right? Um, my instinct told me just go into your corner. um, and then I thought to myself, no, how am I ever going to have this community that I want? How can I talk to guys if I don't reach out to them and then say yes if they reach out to me? So I went skeet shooting with a friend, and I took walks and went to new parks and took walks on beaches and had tea, whatever it was. I would say yes to it, and to really sort of cultivate the guy friendships. Yeah.
Did you cultivate any new friendships of other fathers who had lost children?
Yeah, I did, and that was helpful too. So I joined a couple of grief groups. So in the U.S., there's a nationwide group called Compassionate Friends, which is quite an extraordinary group. It has chapters everywhere across the United States, and it's open to parents, grandparents, and siblings who've lost people, and it's open to people who've lost somebody last week and 30 years ago. And so it's a very interesting mix, sitting in a room with people at different stages of grief. And so that was very helpful. I met some friends through that, and also female friends. I don't have just guy friends, but um, and then I also joined an organization called Our House, which is just based in Los Angeles, but it has an amazing model which I think should be replicated elsewhere. My wife and I joined, and basically they bring together 10 people who have a very similar loss, and you stay with that one group of 10 people for 2 years. You commit to be together for 2 years and go on this journey. And so for us, it was anyone who'd lost an adult child within the past 6 months in a sudden, unexpected way. So we had so much in common. That was really interesting. And we were in the same place in loss. You know, we just lost this child just recently. So that was also a really interesting model for a grief group.
But and then of course we had the pandemic happen while you were in the middle of that. So I
Yeah.
you transitioned to going online, assumably.
Yeah. Yes, we did some online. That was good, but less helpful to be online. I feel like being in person was so much more powerful. But yeah.
And now you've recently opened your home to foster children. So how
Yes.
has that been?
That's been extraordinarily challenging and rewarding, and difficult. You know, I think there's a thought maybe in the back of our mind subconsciously that having children in the house again would somehow ease the pain, and it doesn't at all. It heightens it because here's somebody sleeping in Hart's room and somebody sleeping in Ruby's room, and now it's we're sharing our life and our space with other children, and every act of parenting we do, we of course we think about Ruby and Hart. So it's beautiful and painful at the same time. I talk about how it's sort of, I feel like it stretches my heart.
Mm.
Um, I feel that I feel that viscerally. Um, uh, it's good and it hurts, but it's good. Yeah, yeah,
I always like to ask people who come onto the Conscious Grief series, and I from everything that you share, I just feel like you encapsulate this term, conscious grief. And I like
uh,
to ask each person, if you had to define that term or interpret the term conscious grief, what would you say?
yeah, yeah. I love that term. I love the idea of approaching grief consciously. I sort of I thought in terms of the an examined life as a life worth living, or I guess an unexamined life is not worth living, but whatever. An examined grief, a conscious grief. Uh, it feels like it. I talk in my book about active grieving, which I think is a very similar idea that we're not passive. We're not just sitting in our bed feeling sad and overwhelmed, but we're engaged with it. We're consciously choosing to grieve. And I think that changes our experience of it, having agency. I think it's so important, even in terms of dealing with the PTSD notion that, anyone with a catastrophic sudden loss is going to feel um, um, some PTSD as a result of it. And so if we're able to take action in the trauma, it makes us less passive, um, and it makes us feel like we're, I think, moving through it in a way that's healthy.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, I would like to
Yeah,
ask you one more thing, just for people who
yeah,
are listening to this, who maybe have recently lost a child. Um,
yeah.
what would you say to them?
Um, I would say I'm so sorry, um, and uh, and try not to be afraid of the pain. The pain is is healthy. It's a sign that you love somebody. The reason it hurts so bad is because you love them so much, and it's so scary. Early grief. You feel like if I start to cry, I'll never stop, and I'll go mad. I'll lose my mind. I remember feeling that so clearly, so vividly, um, and yet I discovered that that's not true. That I would weep and weep, and it felt like I was out of my mind with pain, but then it would subside. I think it comes in waves, and it's not like after I wept, I didn't suddenly feel great, but I definitely felt better, um, and I felt more present, more in the world, and was able to think more about Ruby and Hart. So that would be my biggest piece of advice: is don't be afraid of the pain. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful advice, Colin. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up today?
I I wanted to hold up my book because
Please do, yes,
it's
because
so
I
lovely.
have it. It's such a gorgeous
uh,
cover. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, they did such a beautiful job with it. I'm so honored that they that they published me and did such a beautiful job.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
absolutely. And, just to talk actually, to say a bit more about the structure of the book, because it's,
yeah,
it is a story of your own experience, but it's also a teaching and a guidebook as well, isn't it? So perhaps you'd like to just.
yes, yeah. I'd love to. So each chapter is organized around what I felt like was a central issue or challenge that I had in early grief. So one chapter is fear, another chapter is pain, another chapter is guilt, another chapter is despair, holidays. These are all challenges that I encountered with my wife, and in it, each chapter also has a ritual that Gail and I performed that helped us in some way or other bring a community together, allowed us to honor Ruby and Hart, allowed us to get through a very difficult moment, like their birthdays, the days of their death each year. And then it also, at the end of each chapter, there's a series of actions that a reader could take if they were struggling with that particular issue. Rage is another chapter. So there are like actual concrete actions people could take to help them through that. And then also there are journaling prompts. It's called Finding the Words. So obviously I like to express myself. And so I've just encouraged people to find their own words to talk about their grief. And so I have journaling prompts if somebody was stuck and didn't know what to write about.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to very much getting my own copy of that. And I'm going to make sure this is scheduled after March the 14th. So we'll put a link to
wonderful
underneath this interview. It's just been such a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for for being here and creating this book to share with others, which will help so many people.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be part of your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Great to meet you, Colin, and good luck. I know it's going to be a huge success, so I'm excited for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. Bye.